to the Michael Brooks Show Postgame. Greetings, comrades and friends. Welcome new patrons. Thank you, everybody, for making this possible. Thank you, Professor Richard Wolff, for sticking around with us.
Thank you for having me.
Much appreciated. We are going to start by Professor Wolff wanted to make some your mama jokes about Jordan Peterson. No, I'm just kidding. That isn't what's happening. One can only hope. God, that would be so satisfying. I guess he's debating Zizek on Friday.
Yes.
And I have to admit, I like Zizek. It's not because I have any issue. I mean, whatever. I still am a Zizek defender completely, but I just don't care. I'm not interested in this debate.
Also, the way that they're framing the debate is what is better for happiness, socialism or capitalism. And Zizek's a Lacanian, and asking a Lacanian about happiness is sort of...
Yeah, he doesn't believe in happiness, right? So that's a weird... And I'm afraid that even the points that Zizek scores, Peterson and his fans both will not understand.
I don't understand what Peterson's fans make of him in the first place.
You're a little, I don't either. Joining us now for the debunk is Ben Burgis. He's author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, available now everywhere you can find books. Professor Burgis, how are you?
I'm very good.
Thanks for returning. So you have given us a video, and I guess the debunk that you and Professor Wolff are going to do tonight is the calculation argument against socialism. Now, can you set up what is this video you sent? Like, do you know who put it together?
I think that it's one of those, Hayek Institutes, von Mises Institute, one of those kinds of organizations. I'm not 100% sure about this particular video, but I think this is something that comes out of one of the many institutes or organizations that libertarian rich people give to propagate the work of their classic theorists.
Okay, so all right, so this is coming from the Mises Institute. I'm actually very civil libertarian, but in my communist dystopia, if you were watching this, you'd automatically be put on some sort of list. And let's play this clip. Even the buffering of this video is boring.
Ludwig von Mises first articulated some of the main arguments against the possibility of socialism in 1920. He argued that the price system was essential for determining what to produce and how to produce it. It is because of prices set through trade in markets that producers know what the most efficient combination of inputs is, and prices adjusted through supply and demand tell consumers what is relatively abundant and what is relatively scarce. According to Mises, prices make rational economic decision-making possible. Thus, he wrote, quote, "Where there is no free market, there is no pricing mechanism. Without a pricing mechanism, there is no economic calculation." End quote. Moreover, prices change as some goods become relatively more or less scarce, and as technology or people's consumption preferences change. The price system makes it possible for producers and consumers to adjust their decisions and plans as economic circumstances change. Mises wrote that, quote, "In the socialist commonwealth, every economic change becomes an undertaking whose success can be neither appraised in advance nor later retrospectively determined. There is only groping in the dark. Socialism is the abolition of rational economy." End quote.
So first, Professor Burgis, will go to you, and then, of course, Professor Wolff will land this home as well. But I just want to say at the outset, my response, not as a logic professor or economist, is this is great proof against the European accents make you sound smart argument. Go ahead.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, I will say that I don't think that this argument, like last week, a few days ago, we were talking about the argument for the non-aggression principle. I think that's just total nonsense. Once you kind of realize the trick at the heart of it, then it's just not compelling at all anymore. This is a little bit better because it does track, to a certain extent, some real problems in the Soviet model, at least of socialism, with lining up consumer preferences with production decisions. But as a matter of logic, what really hits me about this is if you take it the way that Hayek and von Mises took it, and the way that these guys who made the video are taking it, as an argument against socialism. That's how it's usually presented. We have to have capitalism. We can't have socialism. Sorry, whatever the problems with capitalism are, we've got to keep the capitalist class, in charge forever, because otherwise we're going to run into this problem. It's committing the false dilemma fallacy. So the assumption is that either we have the exact form of socialism, the way of understanding socialism they had in the USSR, or we have capitalism, and those are the only options. And of course, those are not the only options. It's not Soviet socialism or no socialism. There are lots of things that smart socialists have said about how these decisions could be run in a post-capitalist economy. So the simplest and most obvious is that, what the kind of thing that like Bhaskar Sankara will talk about when he talks about socialism, where and a lot of people in the DSA will talk about, where you have certain key commanding heights are nationalized. And, of course, we have abundant evidence from throughout the world, from lots of countries in the West, that there are things like healthcare that have been very nicely provided in a non-market way, right? So that we can have an economy where some elements are planned outside the market. That test has been done very successfully. And that, if we do need a market sector, that those could be organized as workers' cooperatives instead of traditional hierarchical corporations. That's one way around this. Another way around this is Michael Albert and Robin Hanhel talk about participatory economics, Paracon. And Hanhel is the kind of economist who will give you efficiency equations for his proposed system. I don't want to spend a lot of time here taking about it because I'm really curious to get Professor Wolff's thoughts. But, if you look that up, participatory economics, Paracon, that's another model. And I think a third model is the kind of thing that Professor Wolff talks about in his book, Democracy at Work, The Cure for Capitalism, which is that you could have these workers' self-directed enterprises that are maybe ambiguous between workers' cooperatives as we know them and having the public take a stake in them. But maybe that would be a good time for Professor Wolff to jump in.
All right, Dipset. Professor Wolff, please.
Okay, let me organize my thoughts about it around two things. If I heard correctly at the beginning, this was a report on something that came from von Mises in 1920. So let me be generous and assume that he was suffering from the fact that he was talking about what socialism could or couldn't achieve before it had had a chance to do so. Since the revolution was in 1917, it was immediately followed by a civil war, an invasion by other countries. It didn't really get out of a war condition until 1922. Lenin died in 1923, so it's really you have to wonder what he's talking about when he talks about socialism not working in 1920. I'm trying to be nice. I'm trying to be nice.
It's the postgame. Please don't be nice, Professor Wolff.
Then we have countries that call themselves socialist, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Let's take them at their word for the moment. They are socialist. What did their non-rational groping in the dark, to quote him, what did it accomplish? In the case of the Soviet Union, it was the fastest economic growth in the history of the human race. Not bad for an economic system to go from being the poorest country in Europe, the old man of Europe, to becoming by 1975, despite 2 world wars fought on its territory, a civil war, a second civil war around the collectivization of agriculture, tremendous strains. By 1975, it's the number 2 economic power in the world after the United States. As economic growth goes, this is a pretty impressive record for socialism.
Particularly if you're in the dark.
Yeah. But there is one that did better, and that's called the People's Republic of China, which, by the way, is another one of these socialist experiments. It has now become the second power, and arguably on its way to becoming the first power as the old first power sinks. And it also uses socialism to describe itself. So on empirical grounds, goodness. Now, I know that some of my colleagues react to this embarrassment, embarrassing Mr. von Mises and others like him, by announcing that the good results in China, and probably they would extend the argument to Russia, are in fact due to the extent of private enterprise and markets being allowed in, particularly to China in recent decades. But that's a game in which whatever is good is associated with whatever you like, and whatever is bad is associated with whatever you don't like. This is childish, and I'm not going to dignify it by a response. Whatever it is you think Russia and China are, economic growth they have excelled at. For the last 30 years, their economic growth has been faster every single year than that of the United States, despite every effort being made to deny or undercut that reality. Now to the logic of the question. This logic hangs on the following equation, which doesn't work. That scarcity, the actuality of scarcity, is measured by something's price. This is cuckoo. This makes no sense. But let me give you an example. This is not a subtle argument. This is not a subtle argument, right? I'll give you a couple of examples. A safe way to produce massive amounts of electricity is in fact very scarce, because all of the ways we know how to do that are dangerous. They're either fossil fuels that are polluting our air, or they're nuclear energy, which we don't quite know how to control or keep safe.
Don't freak out, nuclear people.
Yes,
that's another group of people that needs to calm down.
There may be ways to change that, but for the moment,
see that?
There may be ways to change that. I'm not forever gloom and doom, but in fact, good energy is scarce. But we don't have people figuring out what the price of energy is, taking into account its real scarcity. Right. We instead measure how much we have to pay for it. And if you subsidize energy, as the world does, and if you make it, you don't care what the pollution is, and you don't care what the real costs all over the place are of getting these things, well, then you have a low price, and then everybody uses it. But that's not a sign of efficiency. And for me, in the age of some ecological and environmental awareness, where we know that if we teach in economics, it's efficient for a company to go into some factory business if they measure the costs of the fuel and the inputs and the labor, and they measure the price of the outputs, and the revenue is larger than the cost. Oh, goody, that's a profit. The prices work that way. It's efficient. We explain to students, if the smokestack of this factory emits terrible particles that cause the paint to chip and the tires to crack and people to get sick, then the cost, the efficiency for the economy has to count all of the costs that flow from this product. But we don't do that in capitalism. We only require the capitalist to count the costs he's responsible for paying. We don't require him to count the costs he is relieved of payment for. Consequently, when he does something responding to the price system, it is exactly groping in the dark, because the efficiency of it is unknown and may be very seriously negative. That is, the costs of the damaged health and the damaged environment may well exceed the profit margin of the product. So that if we actually cared about real scarcity and real efficiency, we wouldn't produce that product, because the costs exceed the revenue. But because capitalists, when they look at prices, only count those they have to pay, we get the result that isn't efficient, and we know it's not efficient, so that this is the purest form of ideological obfuscation. It reverses the real question, substitutes a question of prices, and then makes a flim-flam as if doing things around the price system ipso facto makes you efficient. It never did, and it doesn't now.
And what about the European voice point?
European voice point is very good.
Thank you.
The only problem with it is that I periodically resort to French and German, which were my first languages, and I inflect my English a little just to get a little more
fine.
levitation.
Work that hustle. But it doesn't work on me, frankly. I don't know, no respect for Europeans here. None. You guys, that was great. Professor Burgis, get his book. Give them an argument, Logic for the Left.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, going to be if you're listening to this in Los Angeles right now, then very shortly, I think in about 10 minutes, going to be on the David Feldman show.
Click.
Is going to be on 90.7 FM. And of course, you should finish listening to this show before you change.
Correct.
You know, obviously, right? But once the show is over, if that's still going on, I'm going to be on that. And that was a really fun discussion about Marx and socialism and Bernie Sanders and a lot of other things.
David Feldman is awesome, and I'm glad that this is your second appearance on that great show. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike.
All right. So, Professor Wolff, first we're going to get to some questions, and I'll get back into the call system. But first, I want to play this clip as part of a new segment we're doing. And do we have the sound drop ready for our new segment? Our new segment is called Bad, and we actually really, I guess the shout out is something good, but we probably should do a couplet in the post game where we do something that is good. But this is a segment where we call Bad, and do we have the drop ready for it?
I will have.
You have the drop. Okay. How should I take a question while you look for that?
Here it is.
Okay. Here it is.
No good, really bad for you.
That's the intro to the segment, and this was an interview. Talk about the few. This is quite a hegemonic moment. This was an interview that took place on the BBC. I believe yesterday or earlier today. I actually Sky. Excuse me. Oh, Sky. Well, that makes more sense actually. Can somebody and by the way, is this a Twitter clip? Is this okay? Okay. What is the name of this anchor? Can we look it up? So this anchor is talking with a young woman who is facing losing her home and talking about evicted tenants. Watch how this conversation goes. It's actually one of the most appalling things I've ever seen on television. Not saying something.
I mean, where will you go now? I mean, simply you're going to have to find somewhere else to rent, aren't you?
Yeah, so the issue is with 2 months, it's like in London at the moment, it's really hard to find somewhere. You know, it's really expensive. On average, it costs about £2,000 to.
That's not the landlord's fault though, is it? I mean, that's just
that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's just the housing market, isn't it? And the landlord would have the same issues if you decided to move out in 2 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's a systemic problem. This is, you know, if we can't really afford that £2,000, and you know, why should we have to, like, you know, working people, why should we have to raise that just for doing absolutely nothing wrong? Like, why should it be so hard for us to, like, live secure lives? We can't afford to, like, buy a property, like, so, you know, we have to rent.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose some would say, and I am speaking as somebody who has rented flats, who also rents flats out, but especially with the younger generation, in terms of renters, you very often find that tenants don't really know how to do a great deal in homes. So I, for example, have had tenants complaining that lights have popped because they don't know how to change light bulbs. I've had tenants complaining about the heating and they haven't turned the boiler on. I mean, it's just very obvious things. If you lived in a home that you owned, nobody would be able to fix these things for you. They're just things that actually often require a bit of common sense. Do you think you found amongst your friends, perhaps, that you perhaps aren't equipped with all the necessary skills to rent?
Jesus.
I mean, yeah, I think, I don't know, that's a bit patronising really, because, I mean, if, you know, we weren't complaining about things like a light bulb, needing to change a light bulb, those things, like, are easy things to fix. And I mean, if a landlord was getting pissed off by that, surely the you know, reasonable thing to do is to communicate, you know, communicate with each other and resolve that. Like, why should the consequence of that being, like, you know, them hitting, like, an eject button and turning your lives upside down because of that.
Okay,
Doesn't
Kirsty,
seem
we're going to
like
leave
a
it there.
fair response.
Okay, Kirsty, we're going to leave it there, and I should apologise for Kirsty's language there again, if anyone was offended by her language.
I'm offended by a whole lot of everything besides the language. That is so disgusting. What is she said? Pissed off. That's what she was referring to. What was her name? This anchor. This okay. We still can find this evil anchor's name, but Professor Wolff, bad.
Oh, that awful!
Awful.
It graduated from bad some time ago and arrived at awful. And the admission that she has rented flats as well as been herself a renter, so that she's been a landlord, was her own understanding that what she was about to say reflected a different position. You know, what can I say? England, the United States, these are societies in which huge numbers of people are being paid insufficient amounts of money for their labor to be able to afford the housing. That's a failure, not of these individuals, but of the economic system, because it is happening to tens of thousands of people. And you don't want to face it because you would like, people like this anchor lady, to believe that this is some sort of failure of the individual. We used to call this blaming the victim. That's what this is. You're blaming these people. The woman's voice was cracking, the person, the young lady that was being interviewed, because she has to defend herself that with the argument it might not be reasonable to be evicted from a place where your crime is that you don't know how to change a light bulb or turn on the boiler. That's really not relevant. It was introduced by the questioner who doesn't want to face the question with which she began, which is the fact that people are being evicted in large numbers. By the way, it is itself a sign of a capitalism in deep trouble. An economic system is supposed to provide a way for members of a community to carry out together the production and distribution of the goods and services they need to survive. If you do that in a way that makes some people unable to find housing to live on the street, you fail to do the job. The system is breaking down. That's the only reasonable way to look at it. And to blame the people at the poor end of that process is a hustle, is a way to make it an individual problem because you don't want to face the structural systemic problem that it reveals.
And as someone who grew up in situations where I've experienced evictions, I would like to go to some areas I know in Flatbush and talk to someone who's aware of voodoo practices and introduce them to this anchor, which is why I'm asking for the name now.
Jane Secker.
Thank you.
Jayne Secker.
Look forward to it. No, I'm just kidding. But no, I mean, I just could not
It's
imagine anything more obscene on every level than that.
And then to apologize if you're offended by her.
I mean, right. I'm nauseated by this. Let's do a few questions, and I'll also call into the system. Does Professor Wolff know who he's debating at George Mason University? Just asking as an alum who, quote unquote, studied economics there. I can tell you that the experience for me was about 60% boring and 40% inculcation. For instance, I took a course called Economics in Transition, which is dedicated to exploring the neoliberal transformation of post-communist states in the global South. How wonderful it's been.
I do not know the person that I am debating, but you might be able to find it out by going to the university's website on their events listing for the 23rd of April. One of the reasons I agreed to do this is that it was, if I understand correctly, an initiative of students who wanted to open up the space for a wider range of opinions to be aired than they were used to. Oh. And that made the difference for me to go down there.
Because as a Marxist, you're actually committed to exchanging ideas.
Yeah.
Let's see.
By the way, Jordan Peterson, not to beat a dead horse.
Please.
In that debate he didn't want to have and withdrew from at Boise State, he later responded not in a debate, but on his own, because I guess he felt safer that way. But he didn't deal with the ideas that we had raised. What he likes to repeat is he associates with everything having to do with Marxism, dead people. And he's excited by the dead people because he counts them. Right. And so he counts dead people, attributes them to Marxism, which he seems to equate with socialism, communism, and I don't know what other things he thinks of synonymously with those terms.
Postmodernism.
Yeah, that's
another big category mistake there.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah, and I don't know what Muslims maybe. Who knows?
Who knows?
The anarchists. But the interesting thing is he attributes death to that, but to capitalism, which he doesn't understand why anyone would criticize, gets a pass. So that the deaths of colonialism, the deaths of the 2 world wars that capitalism entered into don't count. So he gets a very nicer number. It's a little bit like von Mises counting the prices of things. It leaves out large amounts of things that actually matter to the human race by pretending that prices are a perfect proxy for what is actually going on, and therefore you can rely on them. This counting of dead people seems to work for Mr. Peterson and for others like him as a way to avoid the difficult debates about these issues and to fall back on something which seems open and shut.
Yeah, I remember that. Well, how about no? Was his line with regards to debating you. And also, the other amazing thing about Peterson, I'll just note in a tangent that I'm partially deal with in my book, and obviously I don't mean, I'm not interested in defending what I consider to be the reactionary version of what he's talking about, but what's incredible is that the dual preoccupations he has with preserving social order and social continuity with an apology for capitalism is incredible, is like shockingly contradictory. Because, you know, again, capitalism does melt all of that away. And even the things that we would want to preserve and support, not the stuff he's talking about. But the fact that he doesn't even have like a red Tory, like, well, I want people to be like married and so on, I think. So I better stop making it impossible for them to like live in those normative, traditional lives, right? Yeah.
I mean, this is another good example of hegemony, but for the right. I mean, he's taking all these contradictory positions even, and is finding a hole that is being, put into people's lives because of capitalism and trying to fill it with this very contradictory neoconservatism, neo-Christianity. Yeah, it's quite nasty.
You're calling from an 813 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from? Oh, I think Matt has not put you up, and Matt is not here. So you will get up in a second. Matt, there's a call. Can you throw him up? You're calling from an 813 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hi, this is Ashley from St. Petersburg, Florida.
From St. Petersburg, Florida. Ashley, welcome. What's your question for Professor Wolff?
Wow. Well, I hope this is okay, but I have sort of a generalized question for you, Professor Wolff, and the rest of the crew.
Sure. What is it?
Excuse me. Well, as we see the rise in right-wing fascism and in particular anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Jewish sentiment, etc., we could go on for hours. My question is, how would a President Bernie, for example, or the next president, beat back this tide of right-wing nationalism, this the xenophobia?
No, this is a good question.
How do we do that? How do we get this under control? Because this is not just policy-based. Of course it is, but it's a problem of rhetoric put out by Fox and other right-wing media outlets. And I was just curious what Professor Wolff and you thought we could do in terms, in the short term in particular, to reverse this trend? And then, aside from policy, what sort of rhetorical devices does the left need to be utilizing so that we can push back on this front? I know that you've spoken about international socialism, excuse me, and I'm personally a big proponent, but when I get to the details of, Jesus, how the F are we going
You can say it.
to combat
Postgame.
this? How the fuck are we going to combat the rise in right-wing nationalism with a propaganda machine like Fox? I'm completely clueless, and I need to defer to people far more intelligent than I.
Well, I don't buy your last premise.
would
That's
love to
actually a
hear
really,
your-
really good question. And Professor Wolff, I'm going to go to you. Thank you so much, Ashley. Appreciate the call. How do we combat this?
Well, let me first underscore what Michael said. The last thing you said about your own intelligence was contradicted by everything you said
Right.
before that moment. So you shouldn't be down on yourself this way because you don't deserve it. Very good question and very well thought out and very well expressed, all three.
Yes.
And an urgent question. So you're right on target. My answer, which I may not please you or may not satisfy you, but it's the best I can do, would be a head-on attack on all of this. That this is gross scapegoatism. This is, you can do whatever you want to immigrants. Leave them here, kick them out, treat them abusively. It isn't going to change the basic economic problems of the American working class. It never has. It is a distraction from dealing with those problems. The way to deal with those problems is to provide jobs, to provide income, to provide health care, to provide a subsidized education, which advanced countries around the world are doing all of those things. That's how you solve the problems. Beating up on the poorest of the poor immigrants is a disgusting distraction that you ought to be ashamed of. It's scapegoating. It is being done by people who don't want to do the things that could solve the problems because they don't want to have to pay for them. And instead, to save themselves the taxes they would have to pay to provide the services to the people who need them, they want to turn half of those people who need them into rageful, nasty people about poor folks around them. It's what we used to do in this culture to African Americans. It's what cultures like ours have done. Demonizing the foreigner is a classic old ploy. Look at Mr. Trump. He demonizes foreigners who are immigrants. He demonizes Mexicans for being rapists. He demonizes the Canadians for not doing what he wants. He demonizes the Chinese, and now he's demonizing the Europeans. The one thing all those people have in common, they're foreign. They're different. And you can beat them up, and you don't have to worry because they don't vote for you. This is a crude, self-serving political move by a man who wants to do his job, which is to deflect criticism from a system that doesn't help most people so that they instead get angry at a small minority of immigrants whose presence or absence isn't capable of changing the basic problems we face.
I think, what Professor Wolff said there is exactly right. I would add, this is exactly the tactic, too, that is used by the right to make people, especially working people, especially white working people, especially white males, not see themselves as what they are, as like working class people who have a lot of solidarity with immigrants, have a lot of common interests with all of these people. And instead of, identifying as that, they try to make them identify as some, class that's just being beaten down by everybody because everyone else is a moocher and they're the creators. I think...
And carefully forgetting their history of being themselves the descendants of immigrants who were treated that way.
Exactly, absolutely. And this is something, just maybe a reading suggestion is if you ever read Ernesto Laclau, when he talks about the idea of like the empty signifier, wherein workers are able to recognize themselves in groups that are outside of themselves, so that like a worker in Brooklyn can see solidarity with striking miners in West Virginia. a white person from Texas can see themselves with Somalian immigrants coming into the United States and moving into Milwaukee. Having this kind of solidarity across groups is how you create a hegemonic front that is going to be able to address it, because it's the same people who are pressing all these different groups. It's capitalists and people with political power and people with money. And being able to recognize those commonalities is how we can break through the nasty lies that the right wing tries to push, especially Fox News, especially Trump and all those characters.
Absolutely. And there cannot be, and again, it's funny because I have made this critique with things that we're working towards in the future, like open borders. Yes, Bernie Sanders isn't going to embrace that in this election cycle. However, at the same time, this is an area where nobody, regardless of where they are politically, can indulge the rhetoric or policy set of this stuff in any way, shape, and form. And Trump has enhanced and vastly expanded what this war on immigrants is. But some of the worst policies, I talked about the example of Shine, right, a couple of days ago, the rapper, deported from this country for one crime in the late 90s. That's a bill that Bill Clinton signed into law in the mid-1990s. This is a bipartisan affair, and it needs to be absolutely both overcome in terms of the commonalities and then also morally confronted as, I would say, a counter-hegemonic project of who we are, which is that we don't indulge this bullshit. We fight for precisely the opposite. And I could tell you there's some people in my life that are, that are very close to me that are implicated by some of these things. And it's absolutely disgusting. It's absolutely unacceptable. And, I think in some ways the question, sort of actually is the answer, which is just a lot of energy and intensity to fight back and create a different reality.
Yeah, they at least won't outnumber us.
They won't.
And just to jump in, I also think it's very important, especially on the question of in the United States particularly, and the Fox News question,
yes,
is challenging a lot of these nationality myths that are in the United States. So Matt making the point that he did during the show about the cowboy, for example, right? The cowboy being this like white male character, when the fact is that, the first cowboys, were predominantly black and Mexican. Right? And that's actually where like the whole cowboy culture, the understanding how to raise cattle and take care of them, was something that was learned especially in Texas, and was exported to other parts of the United States. But that art was actually something that was brought into this country in the first place. But the cowboy in the when foreigners talk about the United States, that's who they think of, right? The cowboy culture is such like a like a white American identity, and it's a fake identity. It's a myth, and challenging those wherever you see them is something that's also very important for us to do, because there is that hint of right-wing fascism, white nationalism, and all this stuff that is in a lot of these American myths.
Absolutely.
And we should also remember to point the finger where it belongs. Immigrants come to the United States in large part because there are jobs, and the jobs that are there for them are the jobs that employers would like to pay less wages for than they otherwise might, which is why the employers, are eager to have them. Because even if after a while there's a white backlash or a nativist backlash, then they have also their escape hatch. They become anti-immigrant, throw them out, and then wait for another few years until the noise settles down, and then do it all again, which has been the history of the United States. We shouldn't fall for it anymore. We shouldn't allow this game to be played. If immigrants are going to come in, they're going to get the same jobs and the same pay that everybody else ought to be getting in a full employment society. And if the society cannot provide full employment for its native people and its immigrants who want to come here, then that's a flaw of the system that ought to be addressed, rather than having the two groups of workers beat each other up.
Absolutely. You're calling from a 610 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hello, Michael. It's Mike from Pennsylvania. How are you, bud?
I'm good. How are you doing? What's on your mind?
I'm pretty good. I just want to talk about how right-wing hegemony manifests itself within the Democratic Party.
Okay, please do.
And I don't know if you caught that New York Times article that came out today. That
I mentioned it in the opening commentary. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I recommend that everybody listening to this show find this article and read it, because it will explain to you in minute detail exactly why the Democratic Party does seemingly stupid things constantly. The answer is they're not stupid. It's part of a plan. And they specifically talked about how both Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have been having meetings on how to stop Bernie. And they've been organizing the Democratic Party establishment as much as possible as a way to block Bernie. Now, Neera Tanden is kind of like the face of that movement,
right?
But it's not just her. You know, a month or so ago, there were stories being put out, I believe it was in Politico, about how former Hillary campaign aides were going around trying to defeat Bernie. Say that he wasn't vetted, he got an easy time, and they were going to make it their duty to try to block him.
Right.
One of the other interesting assertions in the piece was that there was going to be no person with a majority of pledged delegates at the convention because of the rule change that eliminated superdelegates in the first ballot. It didn't eliminate superdelegates altogether. They're just not binding in the first vote. They don't count. But after the first vote, say Bernie Sanders gets 45% of the pledged delegates, it would then be possible for the superdelegates to vote to nominate someone else at the convention, which is also part of the plan, apparently. So we're about to see a very interesting fight, to say the least. And according to the reporting, Pete Buttigieg was also in the meetings.
Oh, God.
Which is very interesting.
He's so trash. Jesus.
And, you know, this is not just like something hypothetical or something I read in the New York Times. You know, I worked state-level campaigns. I worked for a candidate who was the only Our Revolution candidate for state senate in Pennsylvania in a very close district. And we had meetings with the lobbyists. We were forced to go to meetings with the lobbyists for the health insurance companies because we were arguing strongly in favor of single payer. And it was some of the most disgusting shit I've ever seen. And we were basically, you know, like told, don't argue for single payer. If you do, there will be consequences, and there were consequences. The former chair of the Democratic Party endorsed the Republican with about a week to go in the campaign. So, like, this is the
so
kind
how
of
do we just one? I mean, this makes total sense, but can you frame it as a question to Dr. Wolff as well? I want to just read from the New York Times piece. This is a great description, and then there's a real reveal here of just bullshit. This is from the piece you're talking about, which is "Stop Sanders, Democrats Are Agonizing Over His Momentum" is the title of the piece. And it goes, from canopy-filled fundraisers on the coasts to the cloakrooms of Washington, mainstream, and I really have a problem, of course, mainstream, Bernie Sanders' policy set is far more popular than these people's policy set, but whatever. Mainstream Democrats are increasingly worried that their effort to defeat President Trump could be complicated by Mr. Sanders. Now, of course, they're worried about him beating them, not Trump. But I like the top of the canopy-filled fundraisers. Mike, thanks a million for the call. Professor Wolff, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, let me start by saying that the New York Times is very clear where it stands as an institution. Right. So assuming that this is not a rogue reporter, but somebody who's part of the apparatus there, this is either a planted story or a story that's very comfortable for Pelosi and Schumer and et al. To see, especially on the front page, so that nobody misses it. So they are ready for this fight. I think hegemony is the question. You know, these are two parties that are both similar in the following way. They are funded by the same capitalist class. Many of the biggest capitalists, if you actually look at the records, fund both of the parties. It's a normal procedure for many of them. They may tilt one way or the other, but they're not foolish. They need to have friends in high places no matter who wins the election. And then the job of the core of the party that requires these donations is to use that money to create the hegemony by building the alliances with the others they need to win the election, which is why they got the donations in the first place, so they can pay back those people with the laws and regulations, or deregulation, as the case may be. And I think that you're seeing the anxiety of this end of the comfortable game that was played. The comfortable game in the Republican Party was to have the Bushes and people like that get the money from all the rich people and then buy off the traditional conservatives and social conservative and all of that. And in the Democratic Party, again, the leadership gets the money from the same donors and then makes sure that the women and the African Americans and the unions get enough of this or that symbolic recognition to hold them in and to play the game. And the thing fell apart for the Republicans in 2016. They figured that out and basically caved. They caved in around Trump. He showed them he wasn't ready to throw them overboard, and they said, thank you very much, and we'll play with you now for as long as you look like you're in the driver's seat. The Democrats didn't have a winner, so they're stuck with having to fight this thing out, and Bernie is the biggest problem that they face. So they're splitting, and they're going to fight. And the people who traditionally ran that party are going to try to do everything they can to prevent Bernie from being able to mobilize enough people at the base of the party to throw them out. And they feel entitled to do that. They feel threatened that they have to do that. And what they have is the money and the media connections, like the New York Times. That's about all they have. They don't have much excitement. They certainly don't have many young people, and they don't have many foot people to run around and do the work. So they're going to have to rely on the money and the media because that's what they have. And the question is whether Mr. Sanders and the people around him understand the Gramscian point that they need allies too, or if they don't, if they continue the same anxiety about people to their left that I talked about earlier in terms of the labor movement, they will also go down to defeat, and for the same reason about the Gramsci issue that you brought up on this program.
Let's play a piece of sound, and then we'll take a few more questions and one or two more calls before we go. But I want to play this. This is Noam Chomsky, was on Democracy Now!, and he connected the situation with Julian Assange with the imprisonment of Lula. And I just want to emphasize, again, the specific crisis around Assange with these specific charges implicate journalism, period. And the conversation can be as limited as that. And I think Noam Chomsky connects these threads very well. And, of course, obviously the imprisonment of Lula is a very big deal to me in this show. And it was nice to see him use an opportunity to highlight this as well as the strategic position of Brazil.
The Assange arrest is scandalous in several respects. One of them is just the effort of governments, and it's not just the U.S. government. The British are cooperating. Ecuador, of course, is now cooperating. Sweden before had cooperated. The efforts to silence a journalist who was producing materials that people in power didn't want the rascal multitude to know about. Okay, that's basically what happened. WikiLeaks was producing things that people ought to know about those in power. People in power don't like that, so therefore we have to silence it. Okay, this is the kind of thing, the kind of scandal that takes place, unfortunately, over and over. To take another example, right next door to Ecuador, in Brazil, where the developments that have gone on are extremely important. This is the most important country in Latin America, one of the most important in the world. Under the Lula government, early in this millennium, Brazil was maybe the most respected country in the world. It was the voice for the global South under the leadership of Lula da Silva. Notice what happened. There was a coup, soft coup, to eliminate the nefarious effects of the Labor Party, the Workers' Party. These are described by the World Bank, not me, the World Bank, as the golden decade in Brazil's history, with radical reduction of poverty, massive extension of inclusion of marginalized populations, large parts of the population, Afro-Brazilian, indigenous, who were brought into the society, a sense of dignity and hope for the population. That couldn't be tolerated. After Lula's, after he left office, kind of a soft coup take place. I won't go through the details, but the last move, last September, was to take the Lula da Silva, the most popular figure in Brazil, who was almost certain to win the forthcoming election, put him in jail, solitary confinement, essentially a death sentence, 25 years in jail, banned from reading press or books, and crucially barred from making a public statement, unlike mass murderers on death row. This in order to silence the person who was likely to win the election. He's the most important political prisoner in the world. Do you hear anything about it? Well, Assange is a similar case.
So obviously I agree with all of that, particularly with Lula, and I want to just underline Professor Wolff. I mean, do you think it's an extreme example, but I mean, is the event of the imprisonment of Lula and these types of maneuvers from the United States to Brazil to India to Hungary, that this is also like part of the reason there isn't the room for the people that are trying to stop Bernie anymore, and I tried to articulate this in my opening, is that there's not enough, well, there's tons of abundance, but if you're going to keep having the kind of market system you have, there is not enough abundance for these compromises anymore. And when there isn't, then the capital class is going to go and migrate to authoritarianism and maybe not put on a nice show of compromise that it might have done in the 90s or the aughts.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing is a change in capitalism, a very basic change, been going on particularly since the 1970s, in which, and allow me to develop it just for a moment,
please,
in which the old centers of capitalism, the place where capitalism grew, England, Western Europe, North America, Japan, these places was where capitalism concentrated. It's where they built most of the factories, the offices, the stores. That's where the struggle with the working class had to come to a compromise that raised wages that were paid for in part by ripping off the rest of the world where standards of living were destroyed, etc. In the 1970s, based on a couple of big technological changes, the jet airplane and the internet, it became possible for capitalists to have, in these old centers, a eureka moment. Why the hell are we here paying high wages to workers when we've created in the very underdevelopment of the rest of the world a mass of people who are desperate to work for us for a tenth of the wage? And they began to leave. They left the United States, they left Western Europe, and they left Japan, and they went to Brazil, but they went even more to India, and above all, to China. And the capitalism, that is the employer-employee relationship, took off in China, India, and Brazil. That's why they had, in part, a golden age, because it had a zooming upturn in Brazil, linked to China, by the way. Yep. But it meant that in the old centers of capitalism, the bloom was off the rose. It's over. You're not going back. The center has moved. The dynamic part of capitalism is over there. Not only are the jobs created there, let's give you one statistic. Over the last 20 years, the real wages of Chinese workers have gone up 4 times. In the United States, the real wages of workers have gone absolutely nowhere. They're stagnant. What a spectacular differential. I mean, it dwarfs almost anything else I could think of to talk about the difference. That means that the places where capitalism made the promise, we will deliver you a good standard of living, we will deliver you a massive middle class that will have lots of it's over. They can't do that. The rising middle class of workers is in China and in India and in Brazil, even there. Smaller though. But in where we live in the United States, it's downhill. And now the struggle isn't share the wealth. It's who's going to take it on the chin as we go down. And those who have it don't want to give it up, which leaves less and less for everybody else. So you need to repress them. You need to deflect their anger onto immigrants or any other scapegoat you can find, because you're driving them in a downward direction, and you don't want them to understand why, because if they did, then the system would be over.
And Lula Libre. Question from Drunk Dalek. Can Professor Wolff lay out the difference, the position, a war of position and a war of maneuver?
No.
Well,
I mean, these are intertwined comments. The idea is that you maneuver the complexity of the hegemonic alliances you're trying to construct so that together the alliance you've built will be in a position to contest for power. It's one thing to be isolated. You overcome that by building an alliance that has hegemonic potential, but then you have to maneuver into the position around an election or around a revolutionary upsurge where you can actually contest for power with a chance to do something. So you have to have the strategy of a hegemonic alliance. You have to maneuver, and then to get into the position, you have to think like that. It's a little bit like the metaphors that come out of the Russian Revolution, Lenin's metaphors of an army. You know, you have to have a left flank and a right flank and people in the back to bring up and replace. You have to think almost like a military campaign, even if that isn't the field on which you're located.
Oh, I think you did answer that very clearly. All right, let's take one more call or two more calls. You're calling from a 402. I apologize, we can't get to everybody. You're calling from a 402 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hi, it's Colin from Nebraska.
Hey, Colin, what's going on? What's on your mind?
Oh, I had a question for Professor Wolff.
Great.
I wanted to ask about your cultural neo-Marxist worker cooperatives.
Okay.
So my question concerns your work on class and surplus, like in relation to your work on helping businesses transition from capitalist businesses to worker cooperatives.
Okay.
So how do you approach and educate workers like during these transitions? Do you use like your class and surplus analysis, or do you use other methods? I don't know, maybe surplus and class should be defined, but if hopefully you get that question, and I can take my call off there.
Thank you.
I try to tailor my language to the audience, or what as best I can gauge what the audience understands, what idioms are comfortable for the audience, what they're familiar with. So I assume that most of my audiences, there are exceptions, but I assume that most of my audiences are not particularly familiar with the value and surplus analysis of Marx, through no fault of their own, but because the educational system in the United States systematically avoids teaching that.
Can you give them a thumbnail of it?
Sure. The basic idea is this, and the way to explain it is to use an example. When you go to look for a job, you sit down with the employer and you discuss all the different things that the job entails. You eventually get to the question, how much am I going to get paid? And the employer says, let's say, $20 an hour. You know something that Marx puts into a beautiful story. You know that that employer is not going to pay you $20 an hour if all you do by your labor each hour is add $20 to whatever it is that that employer sells. The only way you're going to get $20 is if what you do, your brains, your muscle, in that hour adds more than $20 worth of output that the employer will sell, because there's his profit. He pays you the 20, he receives the excess over 20 that your work adds to his output. That, in a nutshell, is what Marx means by workers who are hired in capitalism produce a surplus that they do not get, and that accrues instead to the employer as the profit of the enterprise. And the notion in Marxism that connects to worker co-ops is simply this. If the workers who do the work that produces the surplus want to serve their own best interests, they would not require, not need the employer. They can employ themselves, in which case, collectively, they produce a surplus, but instead of giving it to somebody else, they themselves will decide what to do with it, how to use it, how to distribute it, how to build the business, how to improve their lives and that of their communities. And that would make the workplace democratic. It would mean that the workers, one person, one vote, together not only produced the surplus, but decided democratically what to do with it. We live in a capitalism in which the majority of people are producers of surplus, and a tiny minority get the surplus and decide what to do with it. It's ironic that in a society like ours, which it preaches endless commitment to democracy, that in the workplace, where most adults spend most of their lives, we have excluded it from day one. And I argue, therefore, that the workers would be immediately better off operating their own enterprises, controlling the conditions of their work, the remuneration of their work. But beyond that, it would be the realization of a democracy this country has preached, but never yet achieved, in part because it excluded it from the workplace. So that would make the workers who make the conversion revolutionary leaders in a democratic direction.
Beautiful. All right, final call of the night. You're calling from an 818 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hello, Michael. Can you hear me? Dave,
yes, I can hear you. Is this Dave from Jamaica?
That is he.
Hello, Dave from Jamaica.
Hey, Michael. I'll make it super quick then. I do understand the purposes of public debates. Like if Jordan Peterson wasn't a coward, then you know the debate between him and Professor Wolff would be very interesting indeed. But when it comes to like your personal interactions, I'm not so sure the value of debate when it comes to person, because is it worth it, or should people
in your
be
personal
more
life to debate people?
Yeah.
I feel like it really depends who you're talking to. I don't know, like these kind of like archetypal, like I have some, big Trump head cousin or something. I don't know. Some people want to argue all day. I actually don't. I'm off the clock.
That's what I'm saying.
But
that's what I'm saying.
I don't know. I think in real life though, I loved what Felix said on the show last week though. I loved how he made the point that so many people are totally ideologically confused and totally all over the place. I spoke to a woman once, and again, this is narrow, it's within the realm of electoral politics, but I think it illustrates, and I might have mentioned this last week, but she said, it was like she loved Obama, she liked Bernie, but she refused to vote. She liked Trump, but she thought he was a little too crazy. She wished Biden ran, but Hillary was unacceptable. She would have liked to see Bernie, but on the other hand, she was really excited that Newt Gingrich might be Secretary of State, right? And there were a few things that I could tease out, like there's some crazy pro-Israel stuff there. On the other hand, she did have a sense that like, hey, this is America. Nobody should be hungry here. But it was all impressionistic. I mean, it's all like different personalities, different sentiments at different times. And most people are really like that. And that's one of the reasons that I really think it is very important that we not conceive of what we're doing, counter hegemony, not a subculture. So you have to meet people where they are, and you have to realize that, by the way, sometimes they're right and you're wrong. But I think in terms of not arguing, sure, but I think that there's a lot of conversations on politics. If you don't have an attitude of moralism or evangelical sort of outreach, you can engage people on the real terms of their lives, and you might actually be able to make some progress.
I guess you kind of helped me narrow it down. I guess, should we be more like point to the professionals, like direct them to TMBS, or you know what I mean? Like, because sometimes
you should point everybody to TMBS, and of course also Professor Wolff. Yes.
Yes, I'm Professor Wolff.
Be a business outreach platform.
But Dave, this is something that, especially like coming from, my background, I come from a very like poor background, especially when I go back to the communities that I'm from. I very much talk about politics and work and socialism to those people. And it's very interesting to talk to those folks because they usually get it pretty quickly without any kind of resistance because they've been exploited their entire life. And that's something to me that is very important. Versus, I was the first in my family to go to college, and I'm living this certain life, and now I mingle with people who are, sort of upper middle class. And when I'm out with those folks, am I always, trying to talk to them about Lenin or something like that? Probably not. I think it's more is like recognizing, one, who the subject is that you're speaking to and how you can get your message to them. And two, whether or not, because, we're at a certain point, we're talking about sociability, right? It's like, do we want to be the guy at the party who's like talking fucking politics all the time? No. But like, do we want to be somebody who is advocating and agitating and being a militant for a certain kind of politics in this correct moments? Absolutely, we should be doing that.
Professor Wolff?
Well, I tend to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Dave, Professor Wolff.
Well, I debate every chance I get. I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying. I don't want to be the pest. I don't want to be the one who everybody rolls their eyes when you start talking. I don't want that. I understand that. But shy of that, I like to engage if there's a chance to get somewhere. There are certain folks where pretty quickly you understand they're not allowing this stuff in. Usually it's fear of one kind or another that they're either aware of or not so much. But they're closed off, and it's just going to become unpleasant or go nowhere. But if there's an opportunity, I think, that is part of the Gramsci notion of how you may walk away very frustrated. But my experience is you've left a mark on the person you talk to, even if they don't acknowledge it ever, or maybe not for 5 years, or maybe not till 10 other things happen in their lives that you won't even know about. But we are all part of our encounters with other people, whether we like it or not. If I could make a comment about Pete Buttigieg.
Someone asked, would you acknowledge, this is the last question I'll include, his father translated Gramsci. So could you comment on that? Okay, sorry. All right, cool. You're synchronized, questioner.
Well, I think you are on target.
Dave, thank you for the call.
To bring up Gramsci. Pete Buttigieg's father is named Joseph Buttigieg. He was a longtime professor of English literature at Notre Dame University in South Bend, Indiana, which is why Peter is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. His father was one of the major scholars of Gramsci in the world, a leader of the International Gramsci Society, a person, for example, that I know very well and that I worked with over years.
Wow.
So that this is a person with a deep, abiding knowledge of, commitment to Gramsci. And
so is this a Ralph Miliband situation that we have on our hands?
Well, there are two candidates in the Democratic Party whose fathers are people that I worked with in my life and who share a lot of my perspective. One is Peter Buttigieg, and the other one is Kamala Harris. Both of their parents, in this case fathers, were people that I've worked with. And it is interesting to me that out of all the people in the world, two people that I worked with should have children that ended up in this particular position. Children and parents go their own ways and all the rest of it. But there are things going on in the minds of those two that are not probably going on in the minds of the other candidates because of where they came from. And that's particularly true with Peter Buttigieg.
Well, that's fascinating. All the more formidable in the need to beat them. I did enjoy, and I think we predicted it on this show, that when Kamala Harris did her, me from Jamaica, me smoke a ganja herb, that actually probably a lot of middle-class Jamaicans are not, in fact, Rastas, and they didn't like that kind of thing. And her father put her on blast in Jamaican media and called her out for playing identity politics. And I don't know who he's going to be supporting, but it is quite clear his politics are quite different than his daughter's. So that's kind of a fascinating sub-story. And the way I think part of the reason that Buttigieg has actually gained traction is I think he actually he clearly does think in these terms. I mean, his politics are not like that, but he's quite conscious of how to like. Yeah, even the way he's building hegemony inside the he's triangulating in a very smart. He's not just splitting the difference. He's saying there's a third position here that isn't being articulated, which I actually think is true, and he's getting to it. And
the two others all see him. The two sides see him as less objectionable than the other side.
Right, right. Professor Wolff, I, as always, just can't thank you enough. I hope you'll come join us again soon.
Absolutely. I enjoy doing it, and I would love to come.
It's my honor. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who makes the show possible. Thank you, Warren. Appreciate it. And thanks to each and every one of you. Of course, next week we're off, but there'll be 3 new elicits for you. And I think maybe next week we'll try on Tuesday to release the live show from LA.
Also, not that this is news to anybody watching the post game, but we are at 83 away from 40,000 on YouTube. So subscribe or get your friends to subscribe.
Thanks, everybody.